I'm Ed Adams, and this is the Weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. Hobbies are interesting things. From the outside, they can seem to some like odd ways to spend what little discretionary time you have. But from the inside, they can be those things that make all the drudgery of life have meaning. I think one of Harley-Davidson's slogans is live to ride, ride to live. You could probably replace ride with quilt, fish, or any number of other hobbies. Most of the hobbies that I've been involved with have strong communities that have a deep sense that they need to grow to stay alive. In some cases, it may be true, as some of my hobbies, like amateur radio, are inherently interactive, so if the hobby doesn't continue to grow, eventually I'll pick up the microphone and there won't be anyone to talk to. But genealogy isn't really like that. Yes, we all benefit from the research of others, but I've never gotten the sense that the push to grow the hobby has anything to do with that. I think instead it has more to do with the fact that we've all seen what it's done for us and we want that for other people. If you're a regular listener to this podcast, this week's episode is a little different. I'm sorry I won't be sharing a tip this week, but rather I'll be sharing my why. Why do I care about my family history? How did I get into this? And why do I dedicate what very little free time I have to doing it and talking about it? I've said before that one of my goals behind doing this podcast is to try to get people who have never thought about their family history to start looking into it. I haven't really done much to further that goal, so this episode will be my first step. If you do tune in weekly for the tools and the tips, I'd like to ask you for a favor. Would you please share this episode with one person in your life who doesn't already have the genealogy bug? I think starting an outsider with the why behind the hobby and then working them into the what and the how makes more sense than suggesting that your buddy from accounting check out the episode on DNA when he's never given much thought to his family history beyond the stories his grandmother used to tell him. So now let's talk about why even care about your family history. Well, really, I'm going to talk about why I care about my family history, but perhaps these are some things that might speak to you as well. As the regular listeners will know, I also like to fish, and people fish for all sorts of reasons. But there's some pretty common ones. I think number one on the list of why people fish is because it's a less self-conscious version of mindfulness activities. There are loads of studies on mindfulness and how it can help your quality of life, but I think people get stuck at the idea of acknowledging that something between their ears needs to be fixed, or at least might need some routine maintenance. Fishing allows you to pretend you're doing something else while in fact you're essentially meditating. Similarly, there are lots of reasons that people find themselves attracted to working on researching their family history, but there are probably some common ones that are shared widely throughout the community. I think perhaps the reasons behind how I got started in genealogy might be a little more on the unique side, but the reasons that I've stayed here are probably fairly common. Many years ago, when I was on a deployment to Iraq, I was probably about 8 months into a year-long tour when I got word from my dad that my grandmother had passed away. I very much wanted to get back for the funeral, but I was the company commander at the time, and we were already operating at just a crushing tempo. So I decided to stay with the company, and I compartmentalized that episode and put it out of my mind. Several months later, I got back, and as was the routine back then, I found myself with a lot of free time. The thinking at the time was that, hey, these guys have just spent 12 to 15 months working 18 to 20-hour days, 7 days a week. They need a little time off. But for many, though, that just means more time to spend alone in your apartment, hanging out with 12 to 15 months worth of combat experiences that also got compartmentalized and would now like to get unpacked. It wasn't my first deployment, though, so I knew that activity was the best remedy. My thoughts drifted back to my grandmother and feeling guilty for having not been part of the family's mourning process. She had been sort of the unofficial genealogist for the family. I doubt that she would have thought of herself that way, and she wasn't really doing genealogy so much as she was the family archivist who liked to tell stories. But I didn't know anything about family history at the time, so I just looked at it as the family historian was gone, and we'd lost all those stories. I decided that with all this time off, I wanted to try to recover some of those stories. So, I started going to the library. Ancestry.com subscriptions were expensive back then, although if I knew how expensive they'd get, I'd have thought they were a steal at the time. But our local library had free access to the library edition, and that was good enough for me. I started working on my dad's side of the family because those were the stories that my grandmother had. I started finding names of people who, up until then, had only been names of characters in the stories that my grandmother had told me. But once I started looking at their birth certificates, draft papers, or death certificates, they started to become real and they started to become family. I'd call my dad to tell him about something I just found, and he'd laugh and say, "Oh, you mean Uncle Sandy? Yeah, I knew him." It was comforting to realize that not all those stories had been lost with the passing of my grandmother. My dad had also experienced many of those stories himself, and he enjoyed dabbling in family history research as well. Things really started to click for me, though, when I began to uncover veteran after veteran in my family that I'd never really known about. Digging through their history of service uncovered stories of heartache and loss that rang like chords in my head. These were people who, up until starting my work on my family history, I'd never even known they existed. But now they were people who I understood and who I felt a kinship with beyond just the knowledge that we were related. Finding ancestors who lost everything in war, suffered horrible wounds, and had to start their lives over without a Veterans Affairs or really any other support network beyond their family, but yet went on to become successful business owners, helped put my much less significant challenges into perspective. Reading through service records and seeing the phrase, amputation of lower third left leg, didn't upset those experiences that needed unpacking. Instead, it calmed them. Perspective isn't a cure-all, but it can almost always help when you find yourself in a place that you'd rather not be. And that's what keeps me involved in family history. I'm forever building perspective on my own life. This added perspective can motivate, inspire, comfort, and even warn you. This perspective provides valuable additional context to your sense of self. It can help you filter out the tendencies towards extremes that are so concerning these days. A study was published in early 2023. It indicated that a healthy understanding of family history can be helpful for adolescents navigating the sometimes perilous waters of identity formation. Now, the study was published by BYU, which should give you a bit of pause since the institution has a vested interest in supporting family history research. But the study certainly seems legitimate, and anyone who has spent any amount of time working on understanding their family history would probably agree that their own sense of identity was informed by this process. I mentioned family history helping filter out the extremes. As you look through your family tree, you will find characters who you immediately feel a connection with. But you will also find others that you may find distasteful or even repulsive. But the thing is that you have to learn more about them if you want to keep moving back. And in the process of learning more about them, they become less of an icon of something that you disagree with and become a real human being. I'm not saying that you're going to become a moral relativist in doing genealogy. I'm certainly not. But I think I've become more willing to contend with competing ideologies in a respectful way. All of these people in your family tree were real people, facing real challenges and doing things the best they could. Some ended up making lemonade out of lemons, and some ended up going to prison for murder. I think I've learned to have compassion for people who I might have previously been satisfied with holding only condemnation for. These are all great things and are reasons that I keep coming back, but the number one reason is inspiration. There aren't many people I've researched who haven't given me some sort of inspiration. From the pioneering woman who leaves New York for the wilds of Nebraska, to the immigrants who risk it all for a chance at the American dream, each life story in my family tree sits there just waiting to be told, and they're all amazing. I don't know about you, but I can never have too much inspiration in my life. So if you sometimes feel like you're just going through the motions of everyday life and wonder when it gets easier, I don't know what to tell you other than that building context through family history never changed my situation, but it changed my perspective on my situation and that's oftentimes just as good. Genealogy does take some critical thinking and some willingness to sometimes let go of family mythologies, but it's really not that hard. Step one for most people will be simply picking up the phone and calling family. Have some conversations with your parents and grandparents if they're still alive. Talk to them about their lives. See what your brother or sister knows, and you're well on your way. Then go check out FamilySearch.org or go hit up your local library. Many librarians are at least experienced enough with genealogy to get you started, and once you get hooked, maybe you check out my back catalog. Before you know it, you'll be learning things that change how you think about yourself and your future. I hope you give it a try. And if you do, think about sharing this episode with someone else who might be looking for some perspective. If a friend shared this episode with you and you have some questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter @thewgtpod. I'm always happy to help. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.